Deference was paid to established Protestant denominations. Clergy were cited as authoritative sources, and they often wrote editorials on the subjects of the day. I have to add, not all clergy were equal. You had to be white, and you preferably were either Presbyterian or Episcopalian. If you were Methodist or Baptist, you probably did not write much for the New York Times. And if you're Catholic or Jewish, forget about it. But even though they commented on the issues of the day, their activities rarely made the front pages, a coup that was reserved for those more aberrant and the occasional barnstorming evangelical who was seen as an object of curiosity and fascination. During the 1870s, coverage of these often coincided. Newspapers, along with the rest of the economy, had been battered by the decade's economic downturn. To keep readers' attention as well as to boost sales, editors looked for religion stories that could appeal to both skeptics and believers. They succeeded by covering religious spectacles that informed the pious, entertained the prurient, and often, as an added boon, propelled a political agenda. It was a tried and true strategy. Decades earlier, stories about Whitefield and the prophet Matthias also did all three. But now more was at stake. Newspapers had evolved from small operations to large companies, and they needed ready cash to keep going. Thus, in the mid-1870s, when a heresy trial, a clergy sex scandal, and an urban revival occurred within a few years of one another, all received wide-ranging coverage. David Swing was a popular local pastor in Chicago and a prominent national preacher when he was tried for heresy. Congregants and his ministerial colleagues admired his broad-minded religiosity. Articulating the religious uncertainty of the time, Swing channeled it into an optimistic faith that was rooted in feelings and actions rather than doctrine and theology. Sounds familiar? But Swing's rejection of orthodox teaching and biblical literalism provoked conservatives who argued that religious truth could not be cut to suit the times. So they tried him for heresy. The trial was in Chicago. It was besieged by reporters. There was a daily pool because not everyone could get in. The story made headlines nationwide. Swing eventually won the trial, but his opponents had their own triumph. He resigned rather than face a second trial on appeal. Swing's foremost rival as the leading light of Protestant liberalism was Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher came from a distinguished Protestant family. His father had been a seminary president. He had 15 siblings, and among them, Harriet authored Uncle Tom's Cabin, Catherine advocated for women's education, and Isabella worked for female suffrage. Henry, too, was a social reformer. He edited an abolitionist newspaper, and he spoke out on issues of the day at Plymouth Congregationalist Church. Located in Brooklyn, then the nation's third largest city, Plymouth was a meeting place for the era's movers and shakers. Beecher obviously attracted a lot of critics and a lot of people who were envious of him, and in 1872, Victoria Woodhull, a notorious feminist, suffragist, and free love advocate, broke the story of an adulterous affair between Beecher and a married woman. Woodhull had her own newspaper. It was published by herself and another woman, and I think she was a little tired of being known as a free love advocate and criticized because she was a woman, and here was, Beecher carrying on an adulterous affair. Beecher's paramour was Elizabeth Tilton, the wife of Theodore Tilton, who was Beecher's friend, congregant, and ally in the abolitionist movement. The romance, or the affair, had occurred several years earlier, but everyone had kept it quiet until Woodhull went public. Newspapers nationwide blasted the story of the illicit liaison. Some pundits said it received more coverage than had the entire Civil War. Tilton, a well-known reformer, was doubly upset when Plymouth Church upheld its minister's innocence and expelled him. He turned to the secular courts, suing Beecher for alienating his wife's affections. The press covered the subsequent trial in salacious detail. and from January to July 1875, readers were privy to detail about Beecher's family, Tilton's career, and the emotional needs of each member of the triangle. In Brooklyn, the trio's hometown, the trial also ignited a newspaper war that used religion as a proxy for political rivalries. The trial lasted 6 months and ended with a hung jury. Several jurists explained that if Beecher were found guilty, it would have cast doubt on all religious leaders. Coincidentally, at the very same time the Beecher verdict was delivered, forces for a religious revival were gathering in the city. Dwight Moody, called God's Man for the Gilded Age, had returned to the U.S. after a wildly successful 2-year tour of the British Isles. Eager to bring his message home, Moody decided to kick off his American tour in the City of Churches, as Brooklyn was known then. The city's clergy planned the crusade, which would be boosted by newspaper coverage. Moody well understood the power of the press. When he was a young evangelist in Chicago, he would regularly go up to newspaper offices and harangue the editors for coverage. But Crazy Moody, as the newspapers called him, was treated as a local joke in Chicago until his triumphant British tour demonstrated that religious revivals could boost newspaper sales. Readers were hooked on coverage that charted the evangelist's successful soul saving. Back in the States, where an economic downturn had hit newspapers along with other industries, editors and publishers hoped for a similar outpouring, not necessarily of conversions, but of sales. On the day the Brooklyn meetings began, city streetcars were blazoned with Moody's name, and excitement filled the streets as thousands tried to gain entry into the rink where the service would be held. As the week went on, local newspapers fought over the storyline. According to the Brooklyn Times, Moody's revival had borne spiritual fruit. According to the Brooklyn Eagle, his spectators were curious but not converted. Other outlets found a middle ground. They said crowds thronged the services, but whether they came for entertainment or evangelism was unclear. According to journalism historian Bruce Evanson, the national press saw Moody's stint in Brooklyn as a bellwether for his mission to make old-time religion fit an increasingly modern age. Most were divided on the answer, but they all agreed the crusade was good for business. Not surprisingly, then, papers in other large cities played a central role in publicizing Moody's campaigns in their city. Whether or not he saved souls was secondary to an important truth. He sold newspapers. In some cities, the success or failure of the revival also served as a stand-in for newspaper wars over city leaders and urban morals. Moody, for his part, was thrilled to see the secular media doing God's work. "I pray heaven's blessing to rest upon the press of Chicago," he told them in a widely covered benediction. "I hope they will continue to spread the gospel of Christ as they have done during these meetings." Moody, Beecher, and Swing personified the type of religion news that 19th century newspapers sought. Editors wanted drama, conflict, and color to draw readers and attract advertisers. Yet these were not the headlines that most religious people wanted. They wanted coverage of services, meetings, holidays, and guest speakers. When these stories did not appear, clergy lamented the press's lack of social responsibility and moral leadership. Ministers disparaged the media's commercial orientation. They deplored its sensationalism, and they condemned advertisements that sold useless products and worldly entertainment. They believed newspapers had a social and moral obligation to improve society, which to their thinking meant promoting a Christian worldview. Commenting on the pernicious influence of this new journalism, New York Ministers Association called on the press to stop running unnecessarily brutal details about personal scandals, divorces, suicides, trials, arrests, and executions, as well as to ban ads for illicit behaviors like gambling. Ministers understood that the power to sway public opinion was migrating from pulpit to press. The loss of cultural authority was bad enough, but they were further incensed that newspapers, which once did and still could use moral suasion for social good, were bowing instead to mammon. And this really was at the time when secularism was on the rise. Colleges were getting rid of their religious heritages. Other professions were really making an effort to kind of throw away the religious baggage that they thought prevented them from being part of the new century that was going to be full of progress and technology and science, just the opposite of what religion stood for. One last attempt, though. Charles Sheldon, a Congregationalist minister in Kansas, wove concerns about the role of religion into his 1896 bestseller, In His Steps. The book's subtitle was, What Would Jesus Do? It recounted the efforts of ordinary churchgoers to live out Jesus' teaching. Yes, this is where the saying comes from. Among their number is a newspaper editor who seeks to remake his paper according to Christian values. Several years later, Sheldon had the opportunity to do just that. The owner of the Topeka Daily Capital suggested he put his ideas into practice. For a week in March 1900, the Sheldon edition was not just the talk of the town, but the entire nation. Reporters descended on the small Kansas city, and daily circulation jumped from 11,000 to 300,000+ as copies sold worldwide. Sheldon suspended ads that he deemed illicit and immoral. He told reporters to seek the most vital issues of the day that affect humanity as a whole in an attempt to influence its readers to seek first the kingdom of God. Articles reported on social reform, temperance, world famine, and foreign mission, as well as the evils of corporate trusts, saloons, and the stock market. Local and state news was included, especially if it had a moral component, such as the organization of an anti-cigarette league, or if it was socially redeeming, such as reports from local colleges. Obviously, unlike today.